All right, we are live and on the air. Good afternoon, everyone. Steve Seepersod coming to you from Binghamton University. And yes, campus here looks just like or almost like the picture that we had just before I came on the screen. Not so much the snow on the trees, but the snow is definitely here after we got over a foot of snow about 2 weeks ago. And I know people are always interested if you live somewhere else in the weather in Binghamton. Boy, it's sure going to be cold this coming weekend. So I know those of you in warmer environments certainly remember, and maybe you don't miss those days here in Binghamton, but it's going to be around a high of 10 and a low of -1, -2 this coming weekend. So things that make you nostalgic for Binghamton, I'm sure. But hopefully you're somewhere watching us and very warm and comfortable. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Science of Love and Sex. This is part of the Binghamton Learning Network webinar series. So glad to have you with us. I feel like we just did this. This is the rare back-to-back Wednesdays of Wednesday webinars. We had Women in Wealth last Wednesday and now the Science of Love and Sex here today. Welcome, happy February to everyone, and thank you for joining us. Before I go ahead and introduce our featured speaker, I just want to throw plugs in for a couple of different things. One of them is to get engaged or more engaged with your alumni association, certainly some level of engagement as you are here with us on the webinar today. Check us out at binghamton.edu/advancement. Binghamton.edu/advancement. You can learn more about how to get involved with us here at the university, live and virtual events, this webinar series. We have an alumni travel program, an alumni book club, regional chapters, all sorts of ways that you can plug into Binghamton University and stay connected to your alma mater from wherever you are in the world. And we certainly welcome your involvement as much as you're willing and able to do. Also, we want this to be interactive today. Take your questions. So if you have a question, don't be stingy and hold on to it. Send it in because we want to answer what is on your mind related to relationships, related to love, related to something going on with you and your partner. Maybe you're looking for love and maybe you have love already and maybe trying to make sense of all of that. And today's program, I think, will go a long way to helping you do all of that. So questions, you have them, and our featured speaker will have the answers. I may or may not. I'll leave it to him to do all of that. So if you're watching on Facebook, go ahead and type your question in as a comment right there under the video player. If you're watching on the microsite, if you had registered and you got the custom viewing link, there'll be a spot there to ask a question. Certainly feel free to do that. And from time to time, I'm going to put this graphic up on the screen when it's not covering up anything important on the PowerPoint slide, sseepers@binghamton.edu. That's my email address, and go ahead and send me your questions by email, and I will go ahead and just put these all together and we'll get these into the mix. So this is not going to be necessarily one of those hold all your questions to the end type of events where you forget about the question, you have to log off, or you don't really care about it anymore. We will get these in during the program, and then of course at the conclusion, say in the last 10 minutes or so after the formal presentation is done, that's when we'll be dedicating that time solely to your questions and take us to 1 o'clock Eastern, and we'll wrap it up. And it's not a hard stop on our end. At 1 o'clock, we can go a little bit over if the energy's good, if the questions are good and still coming in, and we'll just close it out where it feels like it's in a good place to do all of that. So let's have some fun, and let's say hello to our featured speaker, Justin Garcia, a 3-time graduate of the Binghamton University, and coming to us from Bloomington, Indiana, where, among other roles, he is the director of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. And I'm hoping I don't have it right in front of me, but I'm hoping I don't goof on the title, but you can tell us more about your background. I want to say Chief Science Advisor for Match.com, which is a very prominent role for him, in addition to all the great stuff that he is doing. Justin, thank you so much for being with us here, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. It's always good to see you, and I'm delighted to be together, and thanks to the Binghamton University Alumni Association and everyone who tuned in. It's good to be with other Bearcats for lunch today. Well, those of us on East time for lunchtime. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to share a little bit about our research program, a little bit of work that I started at Binghamton. I continue here at the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. And then we can open it up. We can talk about a lot. It's Valentine's season. I like to think of it. It's not just one particular day. It's a reminder of the role of connection and love and sex in our lives, and how we harness that, and how we channel that, and how we can use it, I think, to have more fulfilling, intimate lives. So here's what I'm thinking on our layout today. I want to share some data from our latest Singles in America study. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to share another data report that we just released. So it's coming here first. We haven't even published it yet. We just released the data a couple of days ago, and I have an op-ed coming out soon. So I want to talk through that with everyone here. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my new book, The Intimate Animal, which characterizes some of the research program and has some stories from Binghamton. So we'll do that and then open it up for questions. I don't want to present too much. I think there's so much there's so much to talk about the science of love and sex today, including how we're using dating technologies, what's going on with the loneliness epidemic, and how intimacy is reshaping. So I want to dive right into the questions. So
We're having a little bit of technical difficulty. It seems that we've temporarily lost Justin, and now he is back again. So good. I kind of panicked for a second. I haven't had that happen before.
I meant to hit the share screen button and I hit the wrong thing. Sorry, everybody. A little bit of excitement is good. It's actually good for relationships too. You want to have a little bit of novelty and surprise. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. Okay. Here we go. There we go. Okay, here we go. As I mentioned, that I want to talk through this, and Steve, please let me know if this doesn't look right if I screwed this up. But we'll talk through a little bit about.
Sorry, we're all good. So
okay, great.
Roll right along. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Clearly, I'm not too technologically advanced. So I mentioned I want to talk a little bit about our Singles in America study. This is a project that actually started when I was at Binghamton University. I was in the both in the biology and in the anthropology departments, and we have been looking at single Americans now for 15 years. So every year, with partnership with Match.com, we look at a sample of about 5,000 U.S. singles. It's a national demographically representative sample. So we have the number of men and women and young and old and gay and straight and different education backgrounds, religious backgrounds. It's based on what we know in the U.S. Census. So we have a balanced sample. I started this study with my colleague, Dr. Helen Fisher, and in recent years, working closely with my colleague, Dr. Amanda Gesselman, a social psychologist. So we look at the attitudes and behaviors of U.S. singles. It is the largest and most comprehensive study of singles and singlehood, certainly in North America, I think in the world. It's not longitudinal. We collect a new sample of 5,000 people every year, but we learn a lot and we're able to track some trends. So I want to highlight what some of those are, what some of the sort of newest things that we found for this year are, just open up our conversation about the science of love and sex. One is, and I'll bounce back and forth. We'll talk about love. We'll talk about sex. We'll talk about where they collide. So we'll start on something about chemistry and sex. I think that's really interesting. What we saw in this year's sample of single adults, so these are people 18 and over, ranging from 18 to 91, I think was the oldest person in the sample. So it's pretty diverse, and we can talk about the generational differences and gender differences. So we found that sexual compatibility was still top of mind for a lot of singles. They're looking for a spark. And I want to come back to this because I think this idea of chemistry and sparks, on the one hand, is exciting. It's I like this idea that people are paying more attention to the role of passion and sex and chemistry in our lives, on the one hand. On the other hand, I worry that it could also be distraction isn't the right word. I worry that we're putting too much emphasis on this idea of initial chemistry, this idea that it happens very early on. I'm going to share some data about love at first sight in a few slides. And that can set up some realistic expectations. So how we balance this desire for chemistry, but when we think chemistry emerges in a relationship. So in this year's data, we found that 58% of women were uninterested in casual sex versus 39% of men. So a big gender difference there, but also pretty high numbers, close to 4 in 10 men and close to 6 in 10 women, saying that so even though 90% of singles are saying chemistry is crucial to a romantic relationship, a lot of them are saying, well, but I don't want that chemistry to be casual. I'm more interested in that chemistry being in the context of committed relationships. Now, That itself is interesting. For the last 15 years, some of my work and other work, we've looked at hookup behavior and friends with benefits and casual sex behavior. That's still happening. Casual sex hasn't gone away, but we're seeing more and more single Americans saying, I want chemistry, but I want it in the context of a long-term relationship. I want it in the context of a partnership. Um, so 90% say they think that this chemistry is crucial. 72% claim that they can gauge that sexual chemistry within the first 3 dates. This is where I mentioned I want to come back to the love at first sight in a few slides too. Pretty high number of people are saying, okay, chemistry is important. And they're walking around saying, I think I can gauge whether I have chemistry with someone, sometimes before we've kissed, sometimes before there's been a sexual event. So we have these multiple ideas going on saying, this is important. Chemistry is important. I think I can suss it out by just getting to know someone a little bit. But I don't want it to be too casual. So this is going to start to make more sense, I think, as we go through a few more slides of how we think about the role of chemistry, passion. In some of our other studies, we did another study looking at a sample of over 50,000 people, not just singles, this is people in long-term relationships. And we looked at a subsample of those that had high levels of passion in their relationships. There are ways that you can maintain that long-term in a relationship. I want to talk about that in the Q&A a little bit when Steve comes back. But those are not things that you tend to notice in the first 1, 2, or even 3 dates. So some interesting science behind our desire for chemistry and passion, but what really leads to it. Let's talk more about that in a little bit. Something else that was interesting in this year's data were people reporting more anger and tempers, particularly on dating apps and websites, but in the dating experience. So what's going on there? So we found that 61% of dating people said that dating profiles feel less authentic than in the past. So there's something going on where, and 70% say that they worry that anger over rejection is rising. So how do we, part of dating, part of courtship is really getting to know someone. In fact, the number one thing that singles look for in a romantic partner, it's not just someone who they find physically attractive. It's not someone who's funny. Those are all important. They're all in the top 10. Someone who's attractive, funny, humorous, smart. But the number one thing men and women of all age categories say that they want in a romantic partner is someone they can trust and confide in. A partner you can trust and confide in is the top trait we tend to be looking for when we're on the dating market, particularly in our most recent data. We see that in the last few years, it's been number one over and over again. So in that context, if we're looking for partners we can trust and confide in, but we see numbers 6 out of 10 people saying, yeah, but I'm looking for someone I can trust, but these profiles, they don't seem authentic. The people I'm meeting, I don't feel like I can, they're being vulnerable. I don't feel like it's an authentic person. And I'm worried about how honest I could be about what I like and don't like because I don't want to anger them because 7 out of 10 people are a little hot to temper, fast to temper. So that tells us that I think what we see going on socially, what we see happening in the news, what we see happening around the world, these rising tensions and emotional outbursts, particularly anger and negatively valenced emotions, people are experiencing it in their dating lives. And what we see is it's giving people pause. I want to talk a little bit later about this sense of all the stress in the world and how that's impacting our nervous system, which in turn is impacting our ability to form romantic bonds and our ability to have sexual interests, that how we adaptively respond to our environments. This tells us that people are looking for connections, but they're worried about how do you really connect with someone? How do you meaningfully connect with someone? And how can you be honest with someone? And are they being honest with us? Again, we'll unpack this as we keep going. But that said, despite that, we found that in this year's sample, we asked people, are you ready for a long-term relationship? Are you actively seeking, casually looking? 46% of singles told us they're ready for a long-term relationship right now. But then when we asked what they were doing, about a quarter said they're actively seeking a romantic partner. These are people who are using matchmakers. They're on dating apps and websites. They're out looking for partners, maybe in a bar, in a club, at church, at school. Interestingly, the apps and websites are the most common way singles have met a romantic partner today. much more than a bar or club. I think the most recent data was about 6% met in a bar or club, over 40% from an app or a website. So these social technologies, these dating technologies are the most common way people are connecting. Quarter said they're actively looking, 35% say they're casually looking. And then also 40% of our sample said they prioritize finding love. So what they're looking for is, they're looking for a love partner. A slightly higher percentage of men than women. I think that's worth noting that there's often a lot of stigma about what men are looking for in relationships and how they operate romantically. We find over and over again in our studies that men tend to be more romantic than we often think about when we look at gender differences between men and women. They tend to say, I love you first. Studies have shown men say, I love you first in heterosexual relationships. They tend to take longer to get over breakups than women in relationships. They have much more intense emotional reactions to breakups. Men, for instance, are much more likely to commit suicide after relationship dissolution than women. Men have much more intense emotional bonding in romantic relationships than I think we sometimes give them credit for. Okay, but what is this? We hear all this chatter on in the news, on social media, about questions about commitment, and are we really dealing with some kind of commitment philia out there? And what's really going on? So part of this is this question of how we define a relationship and when people are having that talk. Now, a few decades ago, that happened very early on. Let's say a half a century ago. Young men would go to a young woman's home. They partly were courting them, also in some ways courting their family, particularly if we go back before the automobile, if we go back about 100 years, and then through all of human history before that, that you see that commitment was very early on. If you were asking someone on a date, if you were courting them, there was an expectation that came with commitment. As hookup culture rose and people were experimenting with the boundaries of their romantic lives, particularly at the turn of the century, that wasn't as much the case. And there was this caution around, too much focus on what are we doing? What are we doing? What is this? That's changed. We're seeing, particularly with young people, we've swung back to people wanting to know early on, what exactly are we doing? Are we hanging out as friends? Are we getting to know each other? Are we dating? And there's new language that's emerged with that. So young people will, particularly Gen Z, will talk about, well, we're hanging out. And in a context of a potential romantic and sexual partner, they do mean getting to know someone. We're in this prolonged courtship period to see, is this someone who could turn into dating? Is this someone who could turn into a relationship? And I want to talk about that too. I think more and more the pattern we see of young people taking these longer periods of time, more time hanging out, then casually dating, then a committed relationship, then boyfriend and girlfriend, then engaged, then marriage. We've totally expanded the courtship process. We've heard people talk about that as a problem. I actually think the data tell us it's a pattern of caution. It's what my colleague Helen Fisher and I called slow love. I think it's a pattern of young people wanting to know a lot more about partners and partnerships and taking time to grow together and taking time to get to know their partner. That's very different from a few decades ago, where marriage in many ways was the start of a romantic relationship. It was the start of an adventure in life together. Young people today, marriage is the grand finale. They want to already know everything about a partner, and in some cases even live with them before the idea of marriage. So we're seeing that the order of these patterns are changing. But we still see close to two-thirds, a little bit less of daters want a committed, exclusive relationship. Now, I say that, and in the questions we can talk also about this idea of monogamous and non-monogamous relationships. 47% in our sample want sex within a committed monogamous relationship. But we're also seeing more conversations and more data coming out on what's called consensual non-monogamy, or how people are opening relationships. I want to talk a little bit about that when I talk about my book in a few minutes. Romantic thinking is on the rise. It's perfect for Valentine's Day. This is the love at first sight data I mentioned earlier. We found this year it's the highest in any year we've asked it. 60% of singles in our sample believe in love at first sight. So there's a part of me that I absolutely love this. I think it's charming that 6 out of 10 people believe in this ability for love at first sight, that they can see someone in a crowd and connect. And there is something to be said. How is it that all of us interact? Well, not all of us, many of us interact with a lot of people in a day or in a week or in a month. If you're in New York City going to work, you can interact with thousands of people in subways and hallways and Um, but how does that translate into? I often hear people say, well, I haven't met anyone. And I think, well, how many people have you interacted with? There is this disconnect between everyone we interact with and those that we are romantically attracted to. It's called preferential sociality. And in fact, in social species, particularly in species that pair bond like we do, that have the capacity to form romantic bonds, fall in love, we don't mate with just anyone, that we can kind of look out in a crowd and hone in on one individual. We're also not friends with anyone. So there, that in preferential sociality, who you spend time next to, if we were in some species, we're doing grooming behavior, if you're doing social behavior, if you're doing a territory defense behavior, whatever those are, it's not with just anyone in your environment. That we pick certain folks that we like, that we have friendships, and then we have a subset that we're romantically attracted to, that we want to have relationships with. But 60% of singles are walking around thinking, I can look out at that crowd, maybe not pick who I want to be friends with, but I can pick my love at first sight in that. On the one hand, and that's a huge increase from our last times we looked at it. As you can see here, 34% in 2014 said that. And nearly half of people say that they've experienced this love at first sight themselves. And again, more men than women have experienced it. So why did I say that? I also have a little bit of caution around this. Our data also show from other studies we've done that a lot of people, romantic feelings of love can cultivate over time. We found that over 70% of people became attracted to someone that they weren't initially attracted to. And over a third fell in love with someone that they initially didn't think they were attracted to. That tells us that investing in a relationship with someone, investing in getting to know someone, that love can build, that the data on actual relationships and dating tells us that maybe we experience love at first sight, but if you really want a loving relationship or a healthy relationship, which is something different, that can take time to cultivate. Again, not to say that this doesn't happen for some people. It does. We all know, cases of people say, I saw that person across the dining hall and I knew they were going to be my spouse. 73% of our singles believe romantic love can last forever. And indeed, we see in the data, there are plenty of people that do have lifelong romantic relationships. Humans are sometimes characterized what we call serially monogamous in terms of our mating behaviors, but we do know that many people form lifelong bonds. And in the Q&A, I'd love to talk a little bit about what our other studies show in terms of how you can maintain romantic love and passion over the long haul. It is possible, but it takes some knowledge of the human animal, I think. And then also looking at things like destiny, and 69% say they believe in destiny. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. We also know that people value values in their dating. And what I mean by that is, when we think about who we're dating and the traits that we're interested in, it's what social scientists sometimes call homophily, our tendency to look for someone who is similar to us. We see that some people also look for someone not just similar in terms of race or religion or ethnicity or socioeconomic status, but someone who is aligned on values. So what are the things that matter to you? So a lot of daters are looking to not just look at the list of traits in terms of height and religion, but where do you sit in terms of core values? And in fact, high numbers, 71% think that it should be discussed on the first few dates, that very early on you should talk about your values. I think this is also somewhat related to data patterns we've seen on political orientation, that people today are sorting dating on political orientation more than ever before, in part because we use political orientation as a heuristic for what your values are. Let's take a politically charged issue like immigration. You can have a political orientation and you assume, and I think not necessarily correctly based on what we know of the behavioral science, but you assume that people in one political camp or another, one political party or orientation, that somehow tells us something about their views on immigration, which somehow tells us something their views about finances and safety and family and caring for others. Those are somewhat messy heuristics to make. Someone's political orientation doesn't necessarily define all of their values, but there's similar things we're trying to tap into. And that's why we see, and sometimes in early dating, before you can really pull out someone's values, you'll use something like what's your political party, to try and assess that quickly. But we're also using things like pictures and profile information. And in fact, a third of our singles said that they list shared core values as one of the top 3 qualities in a partner. Remember, the number one is still someone you can trust and confide in, but someone with shared core values is also quite high up there. Okay, I want to mention some of this stuff on burnout. I get questions a lot about dating burnout, and aren't we seeing dating burnout? And aren't people really overwhelmed with the apps and the websites and kind of over it? It's an interesting question, and there have certainly been a lot of hot takes in terms of articles and op-ed essays about it. I actually, including me, I just had an op-ed in Oprah Daily come out yesterday about dating apps, which you could look up. But the challenge with, and what I wrote in this Oprah Daily piece, the challenge is that it doesn't appear to be unique to dating. So what we see in our data set and what others have reported are people are reporting burnout across a lot of different domains. People, yes, we found that 53% of singles report dating burnout, but we also see people reporting burnout about work, their career, their education, the media, news, healthcare, family. So this idea that it's somehow restricted to dating, I actually don't think that the technology, the apps, or the websites are causing dating burnout. I think we're seeing larger social patterns of people struggling with social connection, so-called loneliness epidemic, struggling with social behavior, and that dating is a subset of that. One argument that we use here at the Kinsey Institute, some of my colleagues use, is a framework called polyvagal theory. If anyone here is a therapist, you'll be familiar with it. Polyvagal theory, developed by my Kinsey Institute colleague Steve Porges, is this idea that our bodies can adaptively assess our environment, and we respond. And when there's a lot of stress, we can go into a threat response. And if our nervous system is in a threat response, we're not motivated for sociality, and we're most certainly not motivated for love and sex. One way I like to think about it is, in the natural world, you would never see 2 gazelle mating in front of a lion. And in fact, you would never see 2 people kissing in a burning building. You wouldn't see them stop for a conversation either. When our nervous system gets in a threat response, we're not in mating mode, and we're not really in social mode at all either. It's what we call neuroception, as how the vagus nerve is interpreting our environment. So I bring that up because I think that more and more we're understanding this sort of generalized anxiety, that there's all this stress in the world today, that it has to do with everything. It has to do with what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in Minnesota, what's going on with the environment, what's going on with healthcare, what's going on with politics. It doesn't matter your political orientation or your religion or your area. There's just a lot of stuff that weighs on the human animal today. It can't, right? It can't not. That starts to add up. That starts to add up to a low level of stress. Now, if we're walking around, if lots of millions of people are walking around with low level stress, we should expect that to dampen adaptively. It would be an adaptive response to dampen social behavior, to dampen reproductive behavior, to dampen mating behavior. So I think a lot of these things we're talking about, fertility declines, the sex recession, dating burnout, these are all symptoms of larger issues that are going on. That's my take on a lot of this. And in fact, the dating app technologies still present us with more opportunities than our ancestors ever had. You can find someone with the same background, the same religion, the same sports interest, the same hobby, the same kink, same allergy, whatever it is. We have more opportunity than ever before to connect with people. But with that opportunity comes a challenge to manage all of that data. How does the brain process all of that data? And that is a different problem that we then have a hard time focusing in. But we still have this opportunity, and it's still the most common way people are meeting are through these technologies. Okay, so I'm talking about stress, generalized stress. Let me lift us up now and talk a little bit about self-care. We found in our sample that 46% of singles have shifted some of their focus to self-improvement. Singles are increasingly working on making themselves into Mr. and Mrs. Right instead of just out there searching for someone. I want to talk a little bit more about this because I think that on the one hand, this is awesome. On the other hand, it's becoming a bit of a problem for people who are dating. You might be thinking, how is self-care a problem? We're going to get there. But we do see a lot of singles are saying that they want to invest in themselves. Over about a third are saying they want to get fitter and healthier. They want to prioritize their appearance, including hygiene, and as part of their readiness. And a little around a quarter want to travel more, want to become debt free. They want to lose weight. They want to prioritize mental health and wellness. So people are saying that they want to invest in themselves. That self care is important to them, and that makes them a better potential partner as singles. Remember the sample of singles. Self care makes them better partners. I think that's true. I think that's great, bringing our best foot forward for dating. However, I think that for some people, increasingly for young people, they're turning the temperature up too high on their expectations for self care. I'm going to put a pin in that and come back to it in just a few minutes. The other thing that I want to talk about, some of you have seen all these headlines about celibacy and what's going on with celibacy. I don't mean that kind of incel involuntary celibate. That's a separate issue we can unpack, and a quite complicated one in terms of gender norms. But this notion of voluntary celibacy. People who are saying they're kind of opting out of engaging in sex because they want to focus on themselves, or they want to focus on building connections. And in fact, in our Singles in America study, we found that 36% have not had sex in the past year. And of those that have not had sex, a third said that celibacy improved their dating life. They focused more on partnerships and less on sex. I was just on a podcast with Bella Gandhi, a very well-known dating coach, and she's the founder and CEO of Smart Dating Academy. And we were talking about this. And in fact, she encourages people to go on 15 dates, 15 dates before they have a first sexual event. So when we think about people who have a third date rule or a second date rule, which many people have, or a fifth date rule, but Bella's saying 15 dates, as she's talked about publicly. It's this idea of really trying to build connection before sex. Now, I'm not a moralist about this, about the role of sex in our lives. I'm interested in what the data are telling us. For some people, sex early on can lead to falling in love. You can build a lot. You learn an awful lot about someone when you have sex with them. You learn if they're thoughtful, hygienic, funny, if they pay attention to your needs and desires. The body, you learn a lot of sensory information about someone. So there are ups and downs to these different strategies. I think there's pros and cons in terms of what we understand about the role of sex in dating and in relationships. But what this tells us is that more single Americans are opting for this pathway of intentional celibacy. And it's so true across generations. 52% of boomers, 30% of Gen Z, as an example. So there's 36%. We do see some generational differences. Okay. But we also know that despite that, remember I mentioned earlier, 90% of singles are interested in sexual chemistry. We also know that they don't want just sexual chemistry, but they want an interesting sex life increasingly. So we found that 64% of Gen Z, this is the young, of Gen Z say a partner being content with vanilla sex, so-called regular plain vanilla sex, is a deal breaker, highest of any generation. So we've heard these headlines in the news about Gen Z being the kinkiest generation. Well, it turns out that they not only prioritize sex, but they think sex should be something exciting, that it shouldn't just be routine. Now, some of that is probably from the information they're seeing in media. And one argument is that pornography use and attitudes around it are creating, about 56% of singles told us they think it's creating unrealistic expectations. Maybe that's where they're getting their ideas of, what is this notion of so-called vanilla sex? Is it sex that's connecting? Is it sex that's pleasurable? Or are they expecting more risk-taking in the bedroom, or maybe out of the bedroom? That's what makes it less vanilla. So we know that there's that expectation. It's not just Gen Z. 50% of millennials say that they are bored of this so-called vanilla sex. That's the highest of any generations. So we see more people not only saying that they prioritize chemistry and passion and sexual connection in relationships, but increasingly that there's pressure that sex is supposed to be part of exploration. What psychologists sometimes call the expansion of self, that people are increasingly looking at their sexual lives and saying, this is a place, this is a container for which I want novelty. I want to experience new things. I want to try something different. Now, what that is and what one's comfort level is very complicated across not just generations, but across individual personalities, across body types, across relationship dynamics. And there's a little bit of evidence from other studies that for some people, expanding and trying new things can be fun and exciting. For others, it can be startling and worrisome and challenging. And in some cases, it could be great for a relationship. In other cases, it could be um, damning for a relationship. So there's not a one size fit all solution to this idea that experimenting sexually is always great for people. Interestingly, in a separate study, in our COVID study we did here at the Institute, we found that about 1 in 5 people during the pandemic tried something new in their sexual life. So I think that is also telling that it took the pandemic, it took being locked up in some ways or socially isolated for so many people in relationships to turn to their partner and say, "Is there anything we never tried? Is there anything you want to experiment with?" And in fact, about 1 in 5 did when they had this more focused time with their partners. And in fact, most marriages did quite well in the pandemic. Over 80% of marriages said they improved during the pandemic. So I think a lot of growth happened in relationships and our expectations in relationships during the pandemic, despite the challenges that it brought to so many people in terms of health and emotional well-being.
I'm going to jump in
I
with
get
a
ready to
few
wrap up.
questions, if it's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, of course.
And if we could just bring back that last slide you just had up before
Yeah.
we changed, because I had a question that was based on the one before this, and then I saw this one. I'm like, okay, great. I think I'm on the right track, and I'm glad I waited to ask it at the right time. But it's funny about COVID because, yeah, during COVID, not much else to do. It's like you have this partner. It's like, hello, that person's here. So it's kind of
Exactly.
funny you notice the things that you noticed about that. But looking at this one and seeing a growing number of people that want something more interesting and varied in the sexual relationship, and then seeing in the previous slide about what seemed to be like a growing number of people choosing to opt out for the time being, temporarily saying, I want to take a break. It almost like I look at that and tell me if I'm crazy, but is it me, or is it like something almost like mirrors like the polarization that you just see in other elements of society, where it's like those who want to be sexual, they want it more interesting and fun, and those who are not really into that, I want to take a break. We're going this way. We're not kind of moving into the middle. Similar to politically, as a nation, we're very polarized. You're either one side or you're something else, and not a lot in the middle.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great observation, Steve. I really like that, and thanks for the question. Um, the challenge with some of these attitudes about the role of sex in relationships is sometimes we can get really entrenched in them, and it's similar to our political views. So we say, okay, I'm engaging in intentional. I'm single. I'm engaging in intentional celibacy. But then what happens when you meet someone? And I think there's a difference between folks who say, I want to invest more in social connection and less in sex at this particular chapter of life, to when we give ourselves rules, like we say, okay, for 12 months or 18 months, I'm going to do this. And then you meet someone, and part of falling in love with someone is you desire them sexually, is often what happens. And how do you navigate that then? And you say, okay, we have to wait until I hit this particular deadline. That's where I think sometimes having rules about how long you're waiting for something, or how many dates, or how um, how long you want to be celibate, or how non-vanilla you want your sex life to be, that we can walk around with really high expectations, and then we end up saying no to people that we could have potentially really fulfilling relationships with, because we're so focused on the expectation list we created for ourselves. So there's both. Yes, we see these sort of polarization. I like the way you framed it, of folks who are saying, okay, we should prioritize sex more than ever in our relationships. But then also folks who are saying, no, we should have to prioritize social connection more than ever in our relationships. For me, those are two in the same. This idea that we can separate them into buckets. We know that people report that the best sex of their life is in loving relationships. Both men and women have told us this in a different study we did. This idea that you're prioritizing one or the other, as opposed to realizing, well, this happens with overlap. Even this slide here, this question about non-vanilla sex, well, that'll be the most enjoyable, the highest satisfaction when you have partners that you can trust and confide in, because you can feel the safety to explore. Same issue of how our nervous system responds. If your nervous system's a little wound up, it can be really hard to explore because you don't feel safe. If you don't feel safe, you're not going to derive pleasure from a sexual event. And I mean that in the broad sense, I don't of psychological safety. So for me, these things are very much connected. And we are seeing people prioritizing often one or the other. But when we can help ourselves understand they're interconnected, they're not mutually exclusive, that as relationships build, yeah, you can focus on relationships over, let's say, casual sex, but as relationships build, um, often intimacy becomes a sexual behavior becomes a component of that. Sexual desire becomes a part of that. And at the same time, we have data from our studies with my colleagues at Binghamton University, Ann Merriweather and Sean Macy, that there are times that casual sex turns into romantic relationships. We found 51% of people have had a romantic have wanted a romantic relationship out of a seemingly casual sex encounter, and about a third of people, it's happened to them at some point. So not in our attitudes, in our mind, we're separating them, but in reality, they're not as separate.
It's interesting because as I listen to that, and then I think about what you said earlier, it sounds sort of like out of those people that, express that growing desire to have something more varied. Let's just say you're in a new relationship and it seems very conventional, very vanilla in the beginning, rather than working on it, actually, communicating with the person, they just say, I'm going to pitch it and go. And, I wonder if that's motivated by the fear that, hey, the longer I stay into this, it's like sunk cost. And then I'm going to get married to them. And then it's going to become, less and less interesting. It maybe not more interesting over time, but, it's that communication that's very important, because then, what if later down the road, somebody, you mentioned about psychological safe spaces and people shutting down and not being able to experiment. It's like not even being able to perform at all, and how do you workshop through that? If you don't communicate with the person, there's really not going to be much to go on. So it seems like, it's seeing a lot of trends here about, the anger, the impatience, the polarizing attitude. It's interesting to see it play out here. I guess that was more of a comment than a question, but do with it what you like.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it raises an important question of when we think about someone that as a researcher, we'll separate these sort of questions of what's a healthy relationship, what is compatibility, what is someone of high sexual a relationship of high sexual satisfaction, high relationship satisfaction, and they're all a little bit different measures. It's actually why I often try to avoid the term success. What's a successful relationship? Is it one that lasts forever? Is it one that's satisfying? It's those different measurements, and for a healthy relationship, that means one characterized generally by satisfaction, low conflict, that a lot of those traits, a lot of the things that we understand about commitment and attachment and being able to weather storms with someone, storms of life, of uncertainty of life, that comes with time. And in fact, when we look at those couples that have passion over time, a lot of the things they're doing, it's investing in the relationship. It doesn't spontaneously emerge from, and you met someone right away and you're going to have passion for the next 30 years if you decide to stay together that long. That maintain passion in long-term couples, what we know from studies, they do things to invest in it. And some of it is things like intentionality. They light candles, they set the mood, they dim the lights, they read magazines. It's not about the particular tips in a magazine or the particular scent of a candle. We actually found this in a paper we published in the Journal of Sex Research. It was really about the intentionality. How are we going out of our way to say, I value sexual connection in my relationship? That was associated with more passion, more sexual satisfaction. They had more communication. They also engaged in more foreplay and more oral sex, more kissing. So there were certain behaviors as well that were associated with higher satisfaction. So a mixture of intentional activity, some particular behaviors, and communication. And that mix is what we see is associated with passion, and where you have the safety and the freedom to engage in this and some of this non-vanilla activity in a new way. I'm going to just show a couple more slides, and I'm going to take the slides off because I love where Steve's going with this. I want to talk through more of it. So some of our big takeaways are that people are looking to date smarter, not harder, with the use of AI. And I say big takeaways in terms of technology. There is so much we can say here about how people are using technology. I want to hone in on this. Some of these three on the bottom and the funny ones on the end. 16% of singles have interacted with AI as a romantic companion, highest among Gen Z. So that says that people are starting. This is very different. We asked this question a few years ago. It was like 1%. So that tracks with what we're seeing of the rise of AI. But people are experimenting with these, what are called AI chatbot companions, kind of AI boyfriend and girlfriend. Interestingly, hopping to the other side, 40% say that if you were in a relationship with someone and they had an AI boyfriend or girlfriend, it would be cheating. So, how are we really thinking of it? If 4 and 10 are saying it's cheating, then we're thinking of it as a potentially serious source of communication, source of as a confidant, as source as a, um, uh, in some ways, a partnership. Interestingly, though, where we see people are actually using AI at this moment, the AI chatbot isn't the most dominant. It's more using them to help choose a good picture, to help with your first initial messages to a partner. About 26% of singles have used AI in dating, and that way, saying, "Oh, your pictures are too blurry, you can't see your face," things like that. But 49% of Gen Z, so Gen Z, and this tracks with AI use more broadly, are using it much more in their dating life. But there's an interesting catch here. People are using AI for their dating life, but if you use it too much, your potential partners don't like it, because courtship is about vulnerability and honest advertising. So if you get a hint that this person on the other side of the screen is faking it, or they're not real pictures, not real profile, they're using AI to get their responses, you quickly lose interest, because it goes back to that sense of someone you can trust and confide in. It feels like an inauthentic, not dishonest communication. So we have to be cautious, I think, if you're using these technologies, the degree to which you use them. Okay, so that wraps up our Singles in America study. I want to quickly share one study from a different project we did with Match Group, the parent company of Alt Match Connection Study. This is the one I mentioned. We just released this study. And for me, what's interesting here's some data, but I want to hone in on one. We found that 80% of our sample, particularly the Gen Z sample, so honing in on the young people, 80% said that they are interested in a romantic relationship. They desire a romantic relationship in their life. But 45% say they're not ready for a relationship. So they're working, they have this whole readiness checklist that Gen Z is telling us is important. 80% want love, 45% say they're not ready for it. I have a pet theory I'm working on that I think that, particularly for Gen Z, we're seeing that there has been so much emphasis on this self-actualization, on preparing yourself for dating. What the problem is, this idea that you work on yourself in isolation. I got to work on myself. And you have to work on yourself, and then maybe we'll be ready for a relationship. This idea that you go off and do that in isolation and then come to a relationship fully formed, it misses the reality that so much of our growth happens in the context of relationships, in the context of dating and long-term bonds, sometimes short-term bonds. Relationships are a container for becoming ready, of figuring out who you are and what you want, often with a co-pilot, a partner that you can trust to make mistakes and experiment with. So I actually worry about this data in some ways. I worry what it tells us about young people, and the declines in dating, the declines in sexual activity. Are we seeing more and more people thinking that they need to just endlessly work on themselves? And it assumes that working on yourself and being ready is linear, that you work on yourself and one day you wake up and you're there. It's not a linear process. People work on themselves. They move forward, they move back, they move forward, they move back. Life event happens, timeliness, there's real world happens. And I actually think that this is a real challenge, that so many people are just sitting around thinking that one day they're going to just be ready to find love as opposed to pursuing it. And I want to just end with talking briefly about my new book, The Intimate Animal, just released a few days ago with Little Brown Spark. And in this book, I talk a lot about my research here at the Kinsey Institute, some of my research at Binghamton University, and also at the core of it is an argument that I developed when I was still at Binghamton, and I've worked on more here. And it's really the tensions between social and sexual monogamy. And as an evolutionary biologist, we don't talk about monogamy in the way that we often do in the public, or that psychologists do. We talk about social monogamy as the pair bond form relationship. That's the relationship structure, romantic love. And that's different from sexual monogamy or sexual fidelity. And when we understand that there are different mechanisms in the brain and that they both were selected for evolutionarily, I think then we can learn to harness it. When we can understand that we have a desire for long-term intimate connection, but also desire for sexual novelty, well, then we decide, what does that mean? That conflict that's there. Does it lead to infidelity? Does it lead to opening a relationship? Or does it lead to harnessing the desire for novelty and pulling it into our relationships and finding ways to engage in novelty with our romantic partners, use it to strengthen our relationships, not necessarily to challenge them. So thanks so much. Those are my slides, and I will stop sharing the screen and happy to answer more questions and chat together.
That sounds good, and we have some questions coming in. Plus, I wrote down a lot of stuff as we got into the first 20 minutes or so. But I want to get to the viewer questions first, because that's really who we're doing the program for. And my questions, if they never make it to the air, that's fine. It won't really matter all that much.
We can talk
later. we cover those offline. But here's one that came in from a viewer. How do you think having a relationship with AI impedes a person from developing flexibility in human relationships and expectations when it comes to sex? Do you think it may be an element in the anger from rejection you spoke of earlier?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you. I have kind of mixed views about the role of AI in our dating lives. On the one hand, I think it can be helpful for some people. I think particularly for people who are neurodivergent, people who have a lot of anxiety in dating, you can use these technologies to practice what you would say on an initial conversation, on picking photos that you can feel good about. I think that can be good. They're like training wheels in that sense. But my view is that at some point you want to take the training wheels off. At some point you want to ride the bike without the training wheels. That's the problem. So if we imagine that if you have really high loneliness and you have a chatbot and that helps you from being depressed or being unwell, that's great. But we know that the human animal, the way our brain has evolved and works, real human interaction is what's best for psychological and physical health. So I worry that in the same sense of dating, the power of romantic bonds, the power of connecting with another person, that if we use these AI technologies for practice, initial interactions, maybe to fill a void if we're in a particularly lonely spot, okay, but then don't let it stop motivating from really engaging with other people, from building real IRL and real life relationships. So that's my catch. On the one hand, I think there's some potential for benefit as a supplement, but I think there's also potential to distract us from the enormous power of romantic and sexual relationships in our lives and their role in our psychological and physical health and well-being.
Well, it seems like in a situation like that, it's really going to have to be, I think, this mindfulness coming in of saying, okay, you have maybe, depending on the person's situation, this AI relationship or chatbot or whatever it is, whether it's just for love or for something more physical or something they're missing in their lives, becomes like a baseline. And, then it seems like it becomes harder to navigate in real life IRL relationships, not unlike you get an actress or an actor or a TV character in your head, and then you go out looking to try to find that manifestation in the real world. And then there's that disappointment that, oh, well, it's not like the way you script it. Real life and the way people do things is going to be off script and not exactly like what you saw on the television. And it's your ability to adjust to that is going to affect your success or non-success in the dating world. So it seems like those two things, kind of flow together. But there's that sense of, okay, that's fine if you do it, but real life doesn't work that way at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. You nailed it. There's exactly the challenge of moving it. And in some ways, it's the same as the apps and the dating profiles. At some point, you want to move it off into real human interaction.
It was interesting to look at that slide you had toward the start of the webinar. And I think the stat was something like 90% of people really, I'll put my glasses on for a second because I can't see what I wrote, that the chemistry was important to 90% of the people that answered in that survey. And so we come into relationships with that sort of a mindset, and then you get into a long-term relationship and things kind of fall off. What can you do about that, and how and why does that happen? Because it was so important going in, and you would think it would stay that way, and then all of a sudden it's like we just and for some couples they accept it as sort of like, well, that's just married life, that's what you do, and seems like it doesn't. I want to say it seems like it doesn't have to be that way.
Exactly. And it is fairly, so we know that in long-term relationships, often you have more passion early on, and then around 18 to 36 months on average, you start to move into more companionate love. So this idea that you want to sit on the couch with someone, particularly in these cold winter days, but you have a deeper, the attachment, the bonding system gets deeper over time. So sometimes when that happens, you start to sacrifice some of the passion. That's very typical. That's what happens in most relationships, but it doesn't have to be the case. We can harness the passion. We can bring it back in to our relationship if we want. And I think for a lot of people who want to be in a long-term relationship with someone, and you experience new chapters of life, and that could be your career's change, someone has illness, you have kids, your kids, you have new babies, and your babies fledge the house, and those are all new chapters of a relationship, and the dynamic of a couple changes very much in those moments. Um, so how do you still cultivate passion is really, it's the intentionality of saying, how do we pull novelty into our relationship? Maybe that's in the bedroom. Maybe it's taking a vacation. Maybe it's cooking a new meal. Maybe it's taking a class together. Maybe it's trying new restaurants. But that novelty, giving the brain the desire for novelty, you can do it in the context of your relationship with your partner if you're looking to kind of maintain that excitement. And the long evidence suggests even just little things like, taking walks in different areas and cooking different together new meals, and that can have pretty profound effects on our relationship.
Comfortable silences can be good.
Yeah.
Just don't get too comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Click over to another tab and have a viewer question. This is it's a short question, but a long build-up, and I'll read all of it. I found the love of my life at first sight, and we were together for 3 years. When things were good, they were off the charts great. Chemistry and spark neither of us have ever felt, and we were in our mid-40s. We have a lot in common and have a lot of fun together. However, there is a side to my partner that is unacceptable. He can slip into emotional abuse and narcissistic behaviors that have harmed me and us. We have been apart now for 5 months with no contact until this week. He is in therapy and working through his stuff. He took accountability, and I feel hopeful that we can work again someday. Is this even possible, or can one not actually break the cycle of emotional abuse? It's a great question.
It is a great question, and thanks to the person who shared it. Thanks for sharing a piece of your life with all of us today. I'm sorry you experienced that. When we look at the science, when we look at the biology of connection, and particularly the passion you describe, there's two things going on I think are worth noting. One is sometimes, some of my colleagues laugh when I say this because it's not to be a downer. I'm always so excited about the science of connection and passion and love and sex. Sometimes a flame can burn too hot. So sometimes, what I mean by that is sometimes passion can be so intense in a relationship that we start to overlook. I'm not saying that's the case of what you shared. I want to dive more into what you shared in a moment. But sometimes passion is so intense, the flames are so fiery that we can overlook real relational problems because we're focused on the sexual satisfaction, or we're focused on the passion, the connection. And that is different. The biology of attraction, the biology of attachment, biology of lust and libido, that's a different question from a healthy relationship. They're not the same thing. We didn't evolve necessarily to have healthy relationships. We evolved these motivational systems in our what we desire. So when I say a fire can burn so hot, too hot, it's because the passion can be so good that we overlook all of the problems of making it a healthy relationship or not. And we can mistake that feeling of passion for, but it's a great relationship. We're so passionate. It doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy. It doesn't mean it's characterized by being equitable, being safe, being respectful. Having a partner, remember that number one thing, having a partner you can trust and confide in. And that's something men and women both desire. The other part of what you said that I think is helpful when we understand some of the science and biology of love and sex is that you can love someone. You can deeply love someone who treats you badly, and you can love someone and you treat them badly. It's a different question. The question of whether they treat you well, whether they're abusive, that's a question of a healthy relationship. It's a different one of whether you love them. And I think that sometimes we hear people say in the kind of popular world, they'll say something like, love is a verb, it's an action. And on the one hand, I like that. That's kind of cute, and it reminds us that we should if we love someone, we should treat them with love. We should be kind to them. We should take care of them, of each other. The problem with this idea that love is a verb is fundamentally not true. And as a scientist, love is really in many ways a noun. Love is a neuropsychological state of being. So if you are romantically in love with someone, we put people in an fMRI brain scanner and we show them images of their beloved. Parts of the brain are activated in their dopamine systems. It operates an awful lot like an addiction. So you can be in love with someone and have an unhealthy relationship dynamic. You can be in love with someone and treat them poorly. You can be in love with someone who treats you poorly. I actually think that's really helpful rather than pretending that love is always a verb. When we understand that, we can start to separate those pieces and say, yeah, I love him or him or her or them, but I don't have a good relationship with them. And that those are separate pieces. And ideally, we want to have people we can have healthy relationships with. And those can be more complicated. And in the case that the person shared, you often need the help of a professional, clinical professional, a psychologist, a therapist, particularly one with expertise in couples, and relationships, and either for yourself, both for yourself and for the other person. And I would say I'd caution. My only caution is when someone says they're working on themselves, also think about what it is that you need, what it is that brings you joy. Where do you feel safe in a relationship? And we just want to be cautious about being driven too much by passion sometimes.
Well, it's almost time to wrap it up, but when you were talking about libido levels, it made me think of a question that I thought would be on the minds of a lot of people watching, but somebody might be a little bit reluctant to ask. So I would go ahead and do the heavy lifting and ask. And then somebody actually went ahead and asked it. So it's really from them as well, and not just me. But looking at libido levels between two partners, because this tends to be like a common sticking point in an awful lot of relationships where partner A, higher level, maybe they have some spicier interests that they want to do, and that's their comfort zone. Partner B, shyer, they can deal with a lower frequency, they're not as expressive, vanilla is fine with them. How do you bring that in and make that work?
Yeah, it's what researchers call desire discrepancy, sexual desire discrepancy. My colleague Kristen Mark's a expert on this. So when you have two couples that their desires are out of sync with each other, sometimes you have to navigate it. So sometimes it's everything from thinking about how you, in some cases, people open relationships up. In other cases, they have masturbation pattern rituals. But the other part of it, and the challenge about sexual desire, and we see this a lot when there's desire discrepancy, is that often people and couples are assuming desire is spontaneous. That it's, maybe one partner has a higher spontaneous sexual desire, and we assume that the other one, you just wake up and you desire sex. But we know that for many people, particularly for women, so desire discrepancy most often is in heterosexual relationships, male have a higher desire than women, but it's also been documented among gay men couples and lesbian women couples. And there's cases where women have much higher drive than men in heterosexual relationships. So it can come in every variety. One of the challenges is this idea that sexual desire is spontaneous. And we know that it's reactive, it's responsive, what we call responsive sexual desire. Actually, research done here at the Kinsey Institute by my colleague Eric Janssen, John Bancroft, and Cindy Graham looked at what's called the dual control method of sexual desire. And what that tells us is, what that tells us is that what I mean by responsive is in the context of a relationship dynamic. So you're sexual, you don't just wake up and say, hey, I'm horny today, I want to engage in sex, my libido is fiery. Some people are like that. Many aren't, actually. That they need a little bit of romance, they need a little bit of foreplay. So you might think that your sexual desire is actually much lower than it is because we haven't invested. So are you doing things like, are you putting on lingerie? Are you lighting candles? Are you kissing? Are you giving each other massages? Are you engaging in foreplay before sexual activity? All of those things, our sexual desire, our arousal responses, respond to an interaction much more than just sort of spontaneously walking around. So to answer that question, yes, we can get fire up. We can try to get more aligned. Part of it is investment. It's really hearing, what do we need from each other? What do you like? What turns you on? That's the question that not enough couples have. Right? We talk about, oh, we have a difference in our desire for sex. We've got a problem. But if you talk about, are you having the kind of sex you want to be having? Are you asking your partner what really excites you? What turns you on? What do you want to do today? And maybe it's not intercourse sex. Maybe it's out of course sex. Maybe it's a massage. Maybe it's using a toy. Maybe it's using a product. Maybe you're experiencing pain that you haven't really honestly talked about, and you need lubricants or other kind of products or hormones. That, I think, the power of communication to really open up and think about, not just, do you want more activity, but what kind of activity? What kind of sex do you want? What do you need? What makes you feel good? Those are the conversations that we need to be having more and more, because that's what's associated with higher levels of sexual satisfaction for individuals and couples.
Well, this is great stuff. We can cover 2 hours, but that's not going to be really possible today, I think, for either one of us. And we probably lose a little bit more of the audience as time went on, as everybody's has to get back to the rest of their workday. But Justin, thank you so much. This was incredibly informative. It was super interesting. This was the fastest hour of my entire week, and it was really fun. And I hope you found it to be fun as well. Thank you so much. And you're always so generous with your time and knowledge, and wanting to give back to Binghamton and help other alumni and share your knowledge so everybody can enjoy the relationships more. So again, thank you so much, and congratulations on your new book. And we look forward to helping you to get the word out about that. And once again, thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Bearcats.
And thanks all of you. And we'll be back on March 18th with a webinar on AI and intellectual property. So go ahead and sign up for that and join us. For Justin Garcia, I'm Steve Seepersod. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you on the next webinar.